The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone courtyard of Windsor Castle, as guard Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic one final time. His black bearskin hat sat perfectly straight, and his polished boots reflected the early light like mirrors. For 3 years he had stood at this very post, motionless as a statue, watching thousands of tourists pass by with their cameras and curious stares. Thomas had mastered the art of being invisible while completely visible. His training had taught him to ignore everything: the jokes, the attempts to make him laugh, the children pulling faces just inches from his nose. He was a living piece of history, a symbol of centuries-old tradition that demanded absolute discipline and unwavering composure. On this particular Tuesday morning in July, something felt different. The usual crowd of tourists was gathering, but there was an unusual energy in the air. A film crew had arrived earlier, setting up professional cameras at various angles around the courtyard. Thomas had been briefed that they were documenting royal traditions for a historical documentary, but he paid them no mind. His job remained the same regardless of who was watching. As the morning progressed, the familiar routine unfolded. Tourists posed for photos beside him, some brave enough to stand shoulder to shoulder with the stoic guard. Children giggled and whispered, trying to catch his eye. Adults marveled at his stillness, often commenting to their companions about how remarkably statue-like he appeared. But Thomas noticed something else happening that morning. Among the usual crowd of sightseers, there were several people who seemed different. They weren't taking the typical tourist photos or making the usual attempts to break his concentration. Instead, they appeared to be waiting for something specific. A young woman with a guide dog approached the area where Thomas stood guard. She moved carefully, her white cane tapping gently against the ancient stones. Her golden retriever, wearing a bright harness marked "Guide Dog, Do Not Pet," walked beside her with professional precision. The woman seemed lost, turning her head, slightly as if trying to orient herself in the unfamiliar space. Thomas watched from his peripheral vision as she took a few uncertain steps toward the main entrance, then paused. She appeared to be listening for audio cues or waiting for someone to offer assistance. The bustling crowd of tourists moved around her, most too absorbed in their own sightseeing to notice her hesitation. From his position, Thomas could see that she was heading in the wrong direction. The entrance she was seeking was approximately 30 meters to her left, but the path she was taking would lead her toward a restricted area where tourists weren't permitted. The realization created an internal conflict that Thomas had never experienced during his years of service. His training demanded absolute stillness and silence. Royal guards were expected to maintain their posts without breaking character under any circumstances. They were living symbols of discipline and tradition, representing centuries of military precision and royal protocol. Breaking character was not just discouraged, it was forbidden except in cases of extreme emergency or direct threat to the royal family. Yet as Thomas watched the young woman continue in the wrong direction, moving further from her intended destination, and closer to an area where security would need to intervene, he felt something stirring within him that was stronger than his training. It wasn't duty to protocol that was calling to him now. It was simple human decency. The morning continued with its usual rhythm, but Thomas found his attention divided between his ceremonial duties and the unfolding situation before him. Other tourists occasionally offered assistance to the woman, but their directions were often confusing or incomplete. She would start in one direction, then stop and appear more uncertain than before. The professional cameras continued rolling, capturing the timeless scene of royal tradition in action. None of the film crew seemed aware of the small human drama playing out just meters away from their carefully planned shots. They were focused on documenting the pageantry and ceremony, the unchanging traditions that had been passed down through generations of royal guards. As the sun climbed higher and the morning grew warmer, Thomas realized that this day would be different from all the others. The routine he had followed for 3 years was about to be challenged by something his training had never prepared him for: the choice between following protocol and following his conscience. The next few minutes would test not just his discipline as a royal guard, but his character as a human being. Thomas felt his heart rate increase as he watched the situation develop. The young woman with the guide dog had now moved even further from the correct entrance, and he could see that she was becoming frustrated. Her confident stride had slowed to hesitant steps, and she had stopped several times to adjust her grip on her cane and speak quietly to her guide dog. What made the situation more complex was that Thomas could see other guards stationed around, the courtyard facing similar internal struggles. Guard Peterson, positioned near the east wall, had also noticed the woman's predicament. Guard Williams, standing at the main ceremonial post, was clearly aware of the situation as well. All three men had been trained together, had served together, and had never once broken protocol in their years of service. The unspoken communication between the guards was something tourists never witnessed. Through years of shared duty, they had developed an ability to sense each other's awareness and concern without moving a muscle or changing expression. Thomas knew that Peterson and Williams were experiencing the same internal conflict he was feeling, the clash between absolute adherence to tradition and basic human compassion. Small crowd of tourists had begun to gather around the woman, offering various forms of assistance. One elderly gentleman was pointing toward the wrong entrance entirely. A family with young children was trying to help, but seemed confused about the castle layout themselves. The situation was becoming more chaotic rather than helpful, and Thomas could see the woman's discomfort growing. Her guide dog remained perfectly professional throughout the confusion, sitting patiently while maintaining alertness to its surroundings. The animal's training and composure served as a stark contrast to the well-meaning but disorganized efforts of the crowd around them. Thomas found himself admiring both the dog's discipline and the woman's grace under pressure. Then something unexpected happened. The woman turned in Thomas's direction, not because she could see him, but because someone in the crowd had pointed toward the area where he was stationed. As she moved closer, Thomas could see the determination in her posture despite her obvious frustration with the situation. She approached to within a few feet of where Thomas stood, close enough that he could hear her speaking softly to her guide dog. "Find the door, Charlie," she said gently. "We need to find the right door." The dog looked up at her with intelligent eyes, clearly wanting to help, but unable to understand the specific task in this unfamiliar environment. It was at this moment that Thomas made a decision that would later be viewed by millions of people around the world. He had spent 3 years proving his ability to remain motionless and silent under any circumstances. He had endured everything from children climbing on his feet to adults making inappropriate jokes just inches from his face. He had maintained his composure through rain, heat, and the constant pressure of representing centuries of royal tradition. But watching this woman struggle while he had the power to help her was something his conscience would not allow. Thomas began to move, slowly and deliberately, in a way that maintained the dignity of his position while clearly breaking with protocol. He took a small step forward, then another. The movement was so subtle that most tourists didn't immediately notice, but the professional cameras captured every moment. Thomas then did something that royal guards are never supposed to do. He turned his head, looked directly at the woman, and made eye contact with those trying to help her. The crowd around the woman fell silent as they realized what was happening. A royal guard was breaking character, not in a dramatic or attention-seeking way, but with a quiet dignity that somehow made the moment even more powerful. Thomas raised his left arm slightly, pointing clearly toward the correct entrance while maintaining his formal posture. His movement was minimal but unmistakable. Without speaking, he had provided clear direction to both the woman and those trying to help her. The gesture lasted only a few seconds before Thomas returned to his position, but those few seconds had solved a problem that the crowd's well-meaning but confused efforts had only complicated. The woman seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere around her. Her guide dog had also noticed the shift in the crowd's attention and stood more alertly. One of the tourists who had witnessed Thomas's gesture immediately understood and began giving clear, accurate directions based on where the guard had pointed. Within moments, the woman was being guided confidently toward the correct entrance, her path now clear and her destination certain. The crowd dispersed naturally, some following to continue their own tours, others lingering to take photos of Thomas, who had already returned to his traditional stance. But something had fundamentally changed in that courtyard. The other guards had witnessed their colleague's decision and Thomas could sense their approval even though none of them moved or spoke. More importantly, everyone present had witnessed something remarkable, a moment when humanity had taken precedence over protocol, when compassion had been expressed through the smallest possible action, and when tradition had been honored even while being quietly challenged. Word of what had happened spread through the crowd with remarkable speed. Tourists who had witnessed Thomas's gentle gesture began sharing the story with others, and soon small groups were gathering to discuss what they had seen. The professional film crew, initially focused on capturing traditional ceremonial footage, realized they had documented something far more significant than planned. The woman with the guide dog had successfully reached her destination, but before entering the castle, she had turned back toward the courtyard. Someone had quietly explained to her what the guard had done, and she stood for a moment facing in Thomas's direction. Though she couldn't see him, she offered a small nod of appreciation that somehow conveyed more gratitude than words could express. What happened next surprised everyone, including Thomas himself. As the morning progressed, other situations arose that tested the remaining guards' commitment to their traditional roles. A young child, perhaps 4 years old, became separated from his parents in the busy courtyard. He stood crying near guard Peterson's post, looking around frantically for familiar faces in the sea of strangers. Peterson, who had witnessed Thomas's earlier decision, found himself facing a similar choice. The child was clearly distressed, and his parents were nowhere to be seen. Security personnel were present but were dealing with other matters, and the child's crying was becoming more intense as his fear grew. Following Thomas's example, Peterson made a subtle but clear gesture. He looked down at the child, then looked toward the information booth where lost children were typically reunited with their families. His small nod in that direction was enough to guide nearby tourists to understand what needed to be done. Within minutes, the child was being comforted and led toward the proper authorities who could help locate his parents. Guard Williams faced his own test when an elderly man using a walker appeared to be having difficulty navigating the uneven stone surfaces of the courtyard. The man was struggling to maintain his balance while trying to take photos, and Williams could see that he was at risk of falling. Without breaking his formal posture dramatically, Williams shifted slightly to create a more visible pathway and gestured subtly toward a nearby bench where the man could rest safely. Each of these incidents was small in itself, but together they created a pattern that transformed the atmosphere of the entire courtyard. Tourists began to see the guards not just as ceremonial figures or living statues, but as human beings who cared about the well-being of those around them. The respect for the guards actually increased rather than decreased, as people witnessed compassion being expressed within the framework of centuries-old tradition. The professional cameras had captured all of these moments, though the film crew didn't fully understand the significance of what they were documenting. They had come expecting to film traditional pageantry, but instead had recorded something far more powerful, moments when individual conscience had quietly challenged institutional protocol, and when basic human kindness had found expression within the most formal of settings. Social media began buzzing with accounts from tourists who had witnessed these events. Photos and videos started appearing online, shared by visitors who had been moved by what they had seen. The hashtag Royal Guards Compassion began trending as people shared their own experiences and reactions to the guards' gentle breaking of character. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. A retired royal guard, now in his 70s, happened to be visiting the castle that day with his granddaughter. He had served for over 20 years and had witnessed the evolution of the guard's role through changing social expectations and public attitudes. This veteran guard approached Thomas during a brief rotation break and spoke quietly to him. Instead of criticism for breaking protocol, he offered words that Thomas would remember for the rest of his career. "Son, the greatest honor in wearing this uniform has always been serving others. Today you served in the finest tradition of what it means to be a royal guard." The conversation was brief, but its impact was profound. Thomas realized that what he had done wasn't a betrayal of his duties, but rather an evolution of how those duties could be fulfilled in the modern world. The rigid protocols existed for important reasons, but they could coexist with moments of human connection when circumstances truly warranted it. As the afternoon progressed, the guards returned to their traditional postures and protocols, but something fundamental had shifted. They maintained their ceremonial roles with the same precision and dignity as always, but now there was an additional layer of awareness, a recognition that they could honor their traditions while also honoring their humanity. The tourists continued to take photos and marvel at the guards' discipline, but now there was often a different quality to their interactions. People seemed more respectful, more aware that they were in the presence of individuals who took their responsibilities seriously, while also caring deeply about the welfare of others. The day was becoming a turning point, not just for Thomas and his fellow guards, but for public perception of what it meant to serve in such a traditional role in a modern world. The story was far from over, and the impact of these small acts of kindness would soon reach far beyond the stone walls of Windsor Castle. By evening, the footage captured by the professional film crew and various tourist cameras had begun circulating online with extraordinary speed. The video showing Thomas's subtle gesture to help the woman with the guide dog was shared thousands of times within the first few hours. What struck viewers most was not just the compassion shown, but the way it was expressed, maintaining dignity and respect for tradition while prioritizing human need. Television news programs picked up the story by the next morning. The footage was featured on BBC News, CNN, and news outlets across the globe. The story resonated with audiences everywhere because it represented something people rarely see in today's world: the perfect balance between duty and compassion, between following rules and following one's conscience. The woman who had been helped, Sarah Matthews, a 28-year-old teacher from Leeds, was contacted by media outlets wanting to hear her perspective. Her response was both gracious and insightful. "I didn't realize what had happened until someone explained it to me later. What touched me most wasn't just that he helped, but how he helped. He found a way to assist me while still honoring his position and responsibilities. That takes real character." Social media exploded with positive reactions. Comments poured in from people around the world sharing their own stories of times when small acts of kindness had made enormous differences in their lives. The video became a symbol of hope in a world that often seemed focused on division and conflict. Military personnel from various countries began sharing the footage within their own communities, praising the guards for demonstrating that discipline and compassion were not opposing forces but complementary virtues. Veterans organizations issued statements commending the guards for showing that true military bearing included caring for civilians, especially those who needed assistance. The royal family's social media accounts shared the footage with a simple but powerful message: "Proud of our guards who serve with both precision and heart." This official endorsement meant that what the guards had done was not only accepted, but celebrated at the highest levels of the institution they served. Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed over 10 million times across various platforms. News articles were written in dozens of languages, and the story was being discussed on talk shows, radio programs, and podcasts around the world. What had started as a single moment of kindness had become a global conversation about the role of compassion in duty and service. The guards themselves were somewhat overwhelmed by the attention. Thomas, in particular, found it difficult to understand why such a small action had generated such an enormous response. In interviews, he remained humble. "I just did what felt right in the moment. Any decent person would have done the same thing." But experts in human behavior and social psychology began explaining why the story had such powerful impact. Dr. Emma Richardson, a professor of social psychology at Oxford University, appeared on several news programs to discuss the phenomenon. "What we're seeing here is people responding to authentic goodness expressed within structure. These guards didn't abandon their duties or make grand gestures. They found ways to help within their constraints. And that restraint actually makes their compassion more powerful, not less." Tourism to Windsor Castle increased dramatically in the weeks following the incident. Visitors came not just to see the traditional pageantry, but hoping to witness similar moments of human connection. The guards maintained their professional standards while being more aware than ever of opportunities to help when appropriate. The story also sparked important conversations within military and ceremonial units around the world. training programs, began incorporating discussions about how to balance protocol with human compassion. The incident became a case study in military academies, not as an example of breaking rules, but as an example of how true leadership sometimes requires making difficult decisions about when rigid adherence to protocol serves the greater good, and when flexibility might be more appropriate. International recognition came in the form of humanitarian awards and commendations from various organizations. The Guards were invited to speak at conferences about public service, though they generally declined, preferring to let their actions speak for themselves rather than seeking personal glory from what they considered simply doing their jobs properly. The documentary film crew that had originally captured the footage completed their project with a very different focus than initially planned. Instead of a traditional historical documentary about royal ceremonies, they produced a film about the evolution of service and duty in the modern world, using the Guard story as a central example of how ancient traditions could adapt to contemporary human needs without losing their essential dignity and purpose. The impact extended beyond the immediate participants. Other ceremonial guards at various locations began reporting similar incidents where they had found respectful ways to assist visitors while maintaining their posts. The story had given them permission to trust their instincts about when minor protocol adjustments could serve the greater purpose of their roles. Most importantly, the story had touched something deep in the public consciousness, a hunger for examples of goodness, integrity, and compassion expressed through action rather than words. In a world saturated with negative news and cynical commentary, these simple acts of kindness had provided a refreshing reminder that individual choices could make meaningful differences in people's lives. 6 months after the incident, the effects of that single moment continued to ripple outward in ways no one had anticipated. The Royal Guard training program had quietly incorporated new guidelines that acknowledged the balance between protocol and public service. While maintaining all traditional standards of discipline and ceremony, new recruits were now taught to recognize situations where minor adjustments to protocol could serve the greater mission of representing the crown with honor and compassion. Thomas Mitchell found himself in an unexpected position as an informal mentor to younger guards. His experience had demonstrated that breaking character didn't necessarily mean breaking faith with one's duties. During training sessions, he would share what he had learned, that true discipline sometimes required making difficult judgment calls about when strict adherence to rules served the mission, and when small acts of humanity might serve it better. The story had also sparked changes in how the public interacted with ceremonial guards. Visitors to royal sites became more respectful and understanding, recognizing that the guards were not just living statues but dedicated professionals serving in challenging roles. Tourist behavior improved noticeably, with fewer attempts to provoke reactions and more genuine appreciation for the guard service. Sarah Matthews, the woman who had been helped that day, had become an advocate for accessibility awareness. She began working with tourism organizations to improve navigation, assistance for visitors with disabilities. Her experience had highlighted how small gestures of kindness could have enormous impact, and she dedicated herself to creating systems that would make such individual interventions less necessary while celebrating them when they occurred. The guide dog Charlie had unknowingly become famous as well. Photos of the professional working dog standing patiently during the confusion had been shared widely, and Charlie's story helped raise awareness about the important work of service animals. The guide dog organization that had trained Charlie reported a significant increase in donations and volunteer applications following the publicity. International military and ceremonial units had begun studying the incident as part of their own training programs. The story was being used to teach principles of leadership, decision-making under pressure, and the integration of institutional values with personal conscience. Military academies around the world incorporated the case study into curricula about ethical decision-making in structured environments. The documentary that resulted from the footage had won several awards at film festivals and was being used in educational settings to discuss topics ranging from disability awareness to the evolution of traditional institutions in modern society. The film had reached audiences far beyond those originally interested in royal ceremonies, sparking conversations about service, duty, and compassion in various professional fields. Perhaps most significantly, the story had inspired similar acts of respectful protocol adjustment in other institutional settings. Museum guards, courthouse security personnel, and other professionals in formal roles reported feeling empowered to find ways to assist the public while maintaining their professional standards. The incident had provided a model for how institutional roles could evolve to better serve their fundamental purposes. The three guards involved, Thomas, Peterson, and Williams, had developed a stronger bond through their shared experience. They continued their duties with the same precision and dedication as before, but with an enhanced awareness of their role as representatives of both tradition and humanity. Their relationship had deepened beyond mere professional cooperation into genuine mutual respect and understanding. The professional development of all three men had been accelerated by the experience. They were selected for advanced training, opportunities, and leadership roles within the Guard service. Their ability to make sound judgments under pressure, while maintaining institutional values, had marked them as future leaders within their organization. The incident had also led to improved communication between guards and castle management. Regular briefings now included discussions of how to handle various public service situations while maintaining ceremonial standards. The guards felt more supported in their roles and better prepared to handle complex situations that might arise during their duties. Public perception of the Royal Guards had evolved in positive ways. Instead of being viewed as inflexible symbols of outdated traditions, they were increasingly seen as dedicated professionals who embodied the best qualities of both historical continuity and modern service values. Recruitment for the Guard service had increased, with applicants specifically citing the professional example set by guards like Thomas as inspiration for their interest in serving. The story had also fostered better relationships between the guards and other castle staff. Security personnel, tour guides, and administrative staff had gained greater appreciation for the complex role the guards played and worked more collaboratively to ensure positive experiences for all visitors. The entire institution had become more cohesive and effective as a result. Educational institutions began inviting the guards to speak about their experiences, not just the specific incident, but their broader perspectives on service, tradition, and adaptation to changing social needs. These speaking engagements helped bridge understanding between traditional institutions and contemporary communities, fostering greater mutual respect and understanding. The lasting impact extended to the guards' personal lives as well. Thomas A. reported that the experience had given him greater confidence in trusting his instincts and moral compass in all areas of life. The recognition that he could honor his commitments while also responding to human need had application far beyond his professional duties. 1 year later, Thomas Mitchell stood at the same post where everything had changed that July morning. The stone courtyard looked identical, but everything else felt different. The tourists still came with their cameras and curiosity. Children still tried to make the guards smile, and the ancient rituals continued with the same precision they had maintained for centuries. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between tradition and humanity. A new plaque had been installed near the entrance, not commemorating the specific incident but honoring all service members who had found ways to serve the high public while maintaining their professional duties. The inscription read, "In recognition of those who serve with both steadfast duty and open hearts." It was a subtle acknowledgement that had meaning for those who knew the story, while remaining appropriately modest for the institutional setting. The annual review of guard protocols had become more comprehensive, incorporating feedback from both guards and the public about how ceremonial duties could best serve their intended purposes. These reviews weren't about changing traditions, but about understanding how those traditions could remain vital and relevant in contemporary contexts. The process had become a model for other institutions struggling to balance historical continuity with modern needs. Thomas had been promoted to sergeant and now played a role in training new guards. His approach emphasized both technical precision and thoughtful judgment. He would tell new recruits, "Your job is to represent centuries of tradition and honor. Sometimes that means standing perfectly still for hours. Sometimes it means recognizing when a small act of kindness serves that mission better than rigid adherence to protocol. Learning to know the difference is what separates good guards from exceptional ones." The story had become part of the informal oral history of the Royal Guards. passed down through training cycles and shared during quiet moments between shifts. It served as an example of how individual integrity could enhance rather than compromise institutional values. New guards learned not just the rules and procedures, but also the principles that made those rules meaningful. Sarah Matthews had become a regular visitor to Windsor Castle, bringing groups of students and accessibility advocates to experience the improvements that had been implemented following her initial visit. She and Thomas had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to making public spaces more welcoming for everyone. Their relationship exemplified how a single moment of connection could grow into lasting positive change. The documentary about the incident had been translated into over 20 languages and was being used in educational settings worldwide. It had sparked academic research into the psychology of institutional change, the role of individual agency within structured environments, and the ways that small acts of compassion can catalyze broader social evolution. International visitors often came to Windsor Castle specifically because of the story, hoping to witness similar moments of human connection. While such moments couldn't be manufactured or performed on demand, the guards found that their enhanced awareness of visitors' needs led to numerous opportunities for respectful assistance. The culture of the entire site had evolved to be more service-oriented while maintaining all traditional standards. The broader Royal Guard service had experienced positive changes in morale and public relations. Guards at other royal sites reported feeling more empowered to exercise appropriate judgment in their interactions with the public. The incident had provided a framework for understanding how individual initiative could serve institutional purposes rather than undermining them. Military leadership studies programs had incorporated the case into their curricula, using it to explore themes of ethical leadership, decision-making under pressure, and the integration of personal values with professional responsibilities. The story provided a concrete example of how leaders at all levels could navigate complex situations while maintaining institutional integrity. Thomas often reflected on how his split-second decision to help had grown into something much larger than he had ever imagined. He remained humble about his role in the broader changes that had resulted, always emphasizing that he had simply done what felt right in the moment. This humility had become part of what made the story so compelling. It demonstrated that profound positive change often begins with individuals making simple choices to help others. The incident had also influenced policy discussions about accessibility and inclusion in public spaces. Sarah's experience had highlighted how important it was for public institutions to be genuinely welcoming to all visitors, and improvements had been implemented not just at royal sites, but at museums, historical landmarks, and government buildings throughout the country. As Thomas concluded another day of duty, he realized that the most important lesson from the entire experience was perhaps the simplest, that doing the right thing, even in small ways, could have impacts far beyond what anyone might expect. The ripple effects of that single gesture had touched thousands of lives, improved institutional practices, and provided inspiration for people facing their own decisions about when to follow rules and when to follow conscience. The story had become more than just an account of guards breaking character. It had become a reminder that individual choices matter, that compassion and duty can coexist, and that the most meaningful changes often begin with someone simply deciding to help when help is needed. In a world that often felt divided between rigid traditionalism and reckless change, the guards had shown a third path: respectful evolution guided by enduring values and basic human decency.